Subscribe to the channel for more stories. My name is Sarah. I'm 23 years old, and what I'm about to tell you will shake you to your core. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that one cold December night would completely transform my understanding of human nature and change the trajectory of my entire existence forever. I need to share this story before it consumes me completely. The weight of what happened has been crushing my soul for months now, and I can't carry this burden alone anymore. What you're about to hear isn't just another feel-good story about kindness. It's something much deeper, much more disturbing, and infinitely more beautiful than anything you could possibly imagine. 3 months ago, I was living on the streets of Manhattan, surviving day by day with nothing but the clothes on my back and a determination that refused to die despite everything life had thrown at me. The city was merciless during those winter months, with temperatures dropping so low that every breath felt like swallowing razor blades, and every step was a battle against the wind that seemed determined to knock me down permanently. But what happened that night outside Meridian, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the Upper East Side, changed everything I thought I knew about wealth, poverty, and the invisible threads that connect all human souls. I had been walking for hours, searching desperately for any source of warmth or food, when I spotted him through the massive glass windows of the restaurant. He was sitting alone at a corner table, wearing what looked like $1,000 suit, methodically cutting into what appeared to be the most expensive steak I had ever seen in my life. The contrast was almost painful. There I was, shivering in my threadbare jacket that had more holes than fabric, while this man casually enjoyed a meal that probably cost more than most people make in a week. But something about his demeanor caught my attention and wouldn't let go. Despite his obvious wealth and the luxurious surroundings, there was something profoundly sad about the way he sat there, mechanically eating his food without any apparent enjoyment or satisfaction. His eyes held an emptiness that I recognized all too well from my own reflection in store windows. During my darkest moments on the streets, the restaurant was clearly winding down for the evening. With most tables already empty and staff beginning their closing routines, I watched as servers cleared away untouched appetizers and barely touched entrees from his table, and my stomach cramped with a hunger so intense, it made me dizzy. That's when I made the decision that would change both our lives forever. I took a deep breath, gathered every ounce of courage I had left in my battered soul, and walked through those intimidating glass doors into a world I had never belonged to and never thought I would enter. The motord looked at me with such obvious disgust and contempt that I almost turned around and ran back into the safety of the anonymous streets. But something inside me refused to give up, some stubborn spark of hope that had somehow survived months of rejection, humiliation, and despair. I approached the man's table with my heart pounding so violently I was certain everyone in the restaurant could hear it echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandelier. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, both from the cold and from pure terror at what I was about to do. When I finally reached his table, I looked down at him and saw something that stopped me cold. This wasn't just any wealthy businessman enjoying an expensive dinner. This was someone carrying pain so deep and profound that it made my own suffering seem insignificant by comparison. His eyes met mine, and in that single moment, something passed between us that I still can't fully explain or understand. It wasn't pity, it wasn't disgust, it wasn't even surprise. It was recognition, the kind of recognition that happens when two broken souls suddenly realize they're not alone in their darkness. But what happened next would shatter everything I thought I knew about human nature, about wealth and poverty, about the masks we wear and the truths we hide from the world and from ourselves. Excuse me, sir, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the soft jazz music playing in the background. I don't mean to bother you, but I was wondering if you might have any leftovers you're not planning to finish. The words felt like sandpaper leaving my throat, each syllable a small death of my remaining dignity. I had never begged before, not once, during all those months on the streets, but desperation had finally broken down the last walls of my pride. I expected him to call security, to have me thrown out into the cold night where I belonged. I expected disgust, anger, maybe even fear. What I didn't expect was for him to look up at me with tears streaming down his face, his expensive meal forgotten, as his entire body began to shake with silent sobs. "Please," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion so raw it made my chest tighten. "Please, sit down. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze in that moment. Servers stopped mid-stride, other diners turned to stare, and the motor D began, rushing toward our table with obvious alarm written across his face. But the man at the table held up his hand, and somehow, incredibly, everyone stopped exactly where they were. I slid into the chair across from him, acutely aware of how out of place I looked in this temple of wealth and privilege. My torn jeans and dirty sneakers seemed to scream my unworthiness to everyone watching, but his eyes never left mine, never judged, never looked away in embarrassment or disgust. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steadier now but still thick with emotion. "Sarah," I managed to whisper back. "Sarah," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it on his tongue. "My name is Marcus. Marcus Chen, and I need to tell you something that I've never told another living soul." The way he said it sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold December air still clinging to my clothes. There was something in his voice, some terrible weight that made the air around our table feel heavy and electric with unspoken truths. He signaled to the waiter, who approached our table with obvious reluctance and barely concealed disapproval. "Bring us everything on the menu," Marcus said quietly. "Everything. And keep it coming until the lady says she's had enough." The waiter's eyes widened in shock, but he nodded and hurried away. Marcus turned back to me, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. It wasn't kindness driving his generosity. It was something much more complex, much more desperate. "You asked for my leftovers," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But what if I told you that I'm the one who's been surviving on scraps my entire life?" I didn't understand what he meant. How could someone wearing a suit that probably cost more than I had ever seen in one place, sitting in a restaurant where a single meal could feed me for a month, claim to be surviving on scraps? But then he began to speak, and with each word, the carefully constructed world I thought I understood began to crumble around me, like a house of cards in a hurricane. 47 years ago, he said, his eyes distant now, lost in memories that clearly brought him nothing but pain. "I was exactly where you are right now. Homeless, hungry, desperate, standing outside restaurants begging for food that other people didn't want, my breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be possible. The man sitting across from me radiated wealth and success from every pore. His watch alone probably cost more than most people's cars. How could he have ever been homeless? But that's not the part of the story that will break you," he continued, his voice growing quieter and more intense with each word. "The part that will break you is what happened the night someone finally said yes to my desperate plea for help." Food began arriving at our table, plates and plates of the most incredible-looking cuisine I had ever seen. Lobster, thermidor, wagyu beef, truffle pasta, exotic fruits I couldn't even name. The smells were so overwhelming that tears began streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. But I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. Something in Marcus's voice, something in the way his hands trembled as he spoke, told me that I needed to hear the rest of his story before I could even think about eating. "Eat," he said gently, noticing my hesitation. "Please, you need to keep your strength up for what I'm about to tell you." I took a small bite of what might have been the most delicious thing I had ever tasted, but I could barely process the flavors because my entire focus was on the man across from me and the story that was clearly tearing him apart from the inside. "The night that changed my life," he said, his voice now so quiet I had to lean across the table to hear him. "I approached a wealthy businessman outside a restaurant just like this one. Just like you approached me tonight." The parallel sent ice through my veins, but I sensed this was only the beginning. "He invited me in, just like I invited you. He ordered me food, just like I ordered for you." And then, Marcus paused, his entire body shuddering with some terrible memory. "He told me something that has haunted every single day of my life for the past 47 years. The restaurant around us had gone completely silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for his next words. He told me that he had been exactly where I was, standing outside that same restaurant 47 years earlier, asking for scraps from a wealthy man who had once been homeless himself." The implication of what Marcus was telling me hit like a sledgehammer to my chest, leaving me gasping for air in the suddenly suffocating atmosphere of the restaurant. My mind raced to process the impossible mathematics of what he was suggesting, but every calculation led to the same terrifying conclusion. "You're telling me," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself, that this has been happening for over a century. The same pattern, the same restaurant, the same chain. Marcus finished for me, his eyes now filled with a pain so profound it seemed to radiate from his very soul. Each person who receives this kindness is destined to return here, exactly 47 years later, compelled by forces they don't understand, to pass on what was given to them. I pushed away from the table so violently that my chair nearly toppled backward. The logical part of my mind screamed that this was impossible. Some elaborate psychological experiment or cruel joke designed to torment someone who had already lost everything. But the look in Marcus's eyes told a different story entirely. I know how insane this sounds, he continued, reaching across the table as if to touch my hand but stopping just short. I know because I had exactly the same reaction when Robert told me the same story in 1977, and he had the same reaction when Eleanor told it to him in 1930, and she had the same reaction when Thomas told it to her in 1883. The names hit me like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of decades, of lives lived and lost, of souls trapped in some cosmic cycle they never chose and could never escape. The food on the table, which had seemed like salvation just moments before, now looked like bait in some otherworldly trap. But that's not the worst part, Marcus said, his voice breaking completely now. The worst part is what happens to us, in between, what we become during those 47 years of waiting. I sank back into my chair, my legs no longer capable of supporting my weight. Every instinct I had developed during months of surviving on the streets screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this man and his impossible story as quickly as possible. But something deeper, some terrible fascination, kept me rooted to the spot. The money, I whispered, the pieces beginning to fall into place in my mind. The success, the wealth, it's not real, is it? Marcus's laugh was the most heartbreaking sound I had ever heard, a mixture of bitter amusement and soul-crushing despair. Oh, it's real enough, more real than you could possibly imagine, but it's not ours. It never was ours. He gestured around the restaurant, at his expensive clothes, at the Rolex glinting on his wrist. All of this comes with the territory. The moment you accept the kindness, the moment you take that first bite of food, the wheels of fate begin turning. Within a year, opportunities will present themselves. Business deals that seem too good to be true but somehow always work out. Investments that should fail but instead make you millions. Relationships that open doors you never knew existed. The food in my mouth suddenly tasted like ashes, and I struggled not to choke on what I had already swallowed. But there's a price. There's always a price, Marcus confirmed, his eyes now completely vacant, as if he was looking through me into some horrible future only he could see. The price is that none of it belongs to you. You're just a caretaker, a temporary guardian of wealth that exists solely to perpetuate this cycle, and every single day for 47 years, you feel it eating away at your soul. I thought about the sadness I had seen in his eyes when I first spotted him through the restaurant window, the mechanical way he had been eating his expensive meal. Now I understood that it wasn't depression I had witnessed, it was the weight of carrying someone else's life for nearly half a century. The isolation is the worst part, Marcus continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. You can't form real relationships, because how do you explain a life that isn't really yours? You can't find genuine happiness, because every moment of joy is tainted by the knowledge that it's all temporary, all borrowed, all leading to this inevitable moment when you have to pass it on to someone else. Tears were streaming down my face now, not just from sympathy for Marcus, but from the horrible realization of what I had stumbled into. The kindness I thought I was receiving was actually a curse disguised as a blessing. A golden chain that would bind me for the next 47 years of my life. But why? I asked, desperately. Who started this? What's the purpose? Marcus shook his head slowly, as if the weight of it was almost too much to bear. Nobody knows. Thomas, the first man Eleanor met, claimed he had been homeless for as long as he could remember, that he had no memory of life before that night in 1836, when someone showed him kindness in this very restaurant. But even he wasn't sure if he was the first or just another link in a chain that stretches back into the mists of time. The restaurant around us had taken on an otherworldly quality, as if we were sitting in some pocket dimension where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. Other diners continued their conversations, servers went about their duties, but it all felt like an elaborate stage. Production designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy while something far more sinister played out at our corner table. "I have to ask you to make a choice now, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that comes with wealth and power. But also something else, a desperate plea from one trapped soul to another. "You can walk away right now, leave this food untouched, leave this restaurant, and return to your life on the streets. It will be hard, probably harder than anything you've ever experienced, but it will be your life to live." He paused, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my soul feel naked and exposed. "Or you can accept this gift, knowing full well what it means and what it will cost you. The choice is yours, but once you make it, there's no going back. There's never any going back." The weight of the decision crushed down on me like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe in the rarefied air of the restaurant. Every fiber of my being screamed conflicting messages. My body craved the food and the promise of shelter and security, while my soul recoiled from the implications of what Marcus had revealed. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer from the look of resigned understanding in his eyes. "Until you leave this restaurant," Marcus replied softly. "The moment you walk out that door, the window closes, forever. If you've eaten, the transformation begins. If you haven't, you return to the streets, and this opportunity never comes again." I stared at the feast spread before me, each dish representing not just sustenance, but a crossroads that would determine the entire trajectory of my existence. The lobster thermidor that had looked so appealing moments before now seemed to mock me with its rich, buttery perfection. Every bite I had already taken felt like a weight in my stomach, anchoring me to a fate I wasn't sure I wanted. "Tell me about the others," I said suddenly, desperate to understand what I would be stepping into. "The ones who came before us. What happened to them after their 47 years were up?" Marcus's face darkened, and for the first time since our conversation began, he looked away from me. "That's complicated." The way he said it sent ice through my veins, and I knew I was about to hear something that would make the rest of his story seem like a fairy tale by comparison. "Robert, the man who helped me," Marcus began slowly, as if each word was being pulled from him against his will. "He was different after he passed on his burden. The wealth, the success, all of it disappeared overnight, just as it's supposed to, but something else disappeared with it." "What do you mean?" "I mean he aged 47 years in the span of a single day. When I saw him the morning after our encounter, he looked like he had lived through several lifetimes. His hair had gone completely white. His face was lined with wrinkles that seemed to map every moment of joy and sorrow he had experienced during his years of carrying the burden." My blood turned to ice in my veins, and suddenly the warm restaurant felt colder than the December streets I had left behind. "But that's not the worst part," Marcus continued, his voice now barely audible. "The worst part is what happened to his mind. He remembered everything about his 47 years of wealth and success, but he couldn't remember anything about who he had been before. His original identity, his real personality, his authentic self, all of it was gone, consumed by the false life he had been forced to live." I pushed my plate away so forcefully that some of the expensive food spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth, creating stains that looked disturbingly like blood in the restaurant's ambient lighting. "You're telling me that if I accept this, in 47 years I won't even remember who Sarah really is?" "I'm telling you that I can barely remember who Marcus was before the night Robert found me," he replied, his voice hollow and distant. "Sometimes, in dreams, I catch glimpses of the boy I used to be, a kid from Detroit who loved baseball and wanted to be a teacher. But those memories feel like they belong to someone else, like scenes from a movie I watched once long ago." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling out of my chair. The kindness I thought I was being offered wasn't just a 47-year imprisonment, it was the complete erasure of my authentic self, the slow but inexorable death of everything that made me who I truly was. "Then why?" I gasped, struggling to understand the cosmic cruelty of what was being presented to me. "Why would anyone accept this?" Marcus gestured around the restaurant, at the other diners, enjoying their meals in blissful ignorance of the supernatural drama playing out just feet away from them. "Because the alternative is dying on the streets, forgotten and unmourned. Because when you're at the absolute bottom of human existence, even a false life seems better than no life at all." "But it's not a life," I protested desperately. "It's a performance, a 47-year-long charade that ends with you becoming Someone you never were. Yes, Marcus agreed, his voice carrying the weight of decades of regret. But it's a very comfortable charade. You'll have everything money can buy. Respect from people who would have spat on you an hour ago. Opportunities that most people can only dream of. And for most of those 47 years, you'll even be able to convince yourself that you deserve it all. I thought about the months I had spent on the streets, the nights when the cold was so intense I wasn't sure I would see morning, the days when hunger gnawed at my insides like a living thing. The promise of warmth, food, security, and success was almost impossibly tempting, even knowing the price. What happens if I refuse? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Then you walk out that door and return to your life exactly as it was. The homelessness, the hunger, the constant struggle for survival, all of it continues. And Marcus paused, his face crumpling with an emotion so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. I remain trapped in this half-life until I die, carrying this burden alone, for whatever time I have left. The implication was clear. My refusal wouldn't just doom me to continued suffering on the streets. It would sentence Marcus to a living hell with no hope of release. The weight of that responsibility felt almost as crushing as the decision itself. There has to be another way, I whispered desperately. Some loophole, some escape clause in this cosmic contract. Marcus shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with the kind of hopelessness that comes from 47 years of searching for alternatives that don't exist. If there was, don't you think one of us would have found it by now? Robert spent decades researching, investigating, trying to find some way to break the cycle. Thomas before him did the same, Eleanor before him, all of us, searching desperately for a way out that simply doesn't exist. The restaurant around us continued its normal operations. Servers refilling water glasses and clearing tables. Other diners laughing and chatting about mundane concerns that suddenly seemed incredibly precious in their simplicity. None of them had any idea that just feet away, a decision was being made that would determine the fate of two souls for the next half-century. But as I sat there, staring at the food that represented both salvation and damnation, something Marcus had said earlier began to echo in my mind with increasing intensity. Something about Thomas, the first person Eleanor had encountered, claiming he had no memory of life before 1836. What if he wasn't the beginning of the chain? What if there was something even older, even more fundamental at work here? And more importantly, what if the key to breaking the cycle wasn't in refusing the gift, but in understanding the true nature of what was being offered? Marcus, I said suddenly, my voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere that had settled around our table like a funeral shroud. What if Thomas wasn't lying about not remembering his life before 1836? What if he really was the first? Marcus looked up from his untouched meal, confusion flickering across his features. What do you mean? I mean, what if this whole cycle didn't start with someone accepting kindness from a previous victim? What if it started with something else entirely? Something that would explain why Thomas had no memories of a life before. I could see the wheels turning in Marcus's mind. 47 years of accumulated pain and resignation warring with a spark of something that might have been hope. You think Thomas was what? Created for this purpose? I think Thomas might have been the first homeless person to die outside this restaurant, I said, the idea crystallizing in my mind even as I spoke. And I think something or someone decided that wasn't acceptable. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop several degrees, and I noticed that the other diners had gone completely silent, their conversations dying mid-sentence as if some invisible force had suddenly muted the entire establishment. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place like mannequins in a store window. Sarah, Marcus whispered, his voice filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. I think you should stop talking about this, but I couldn't stop. Something deep in my gut told me I was on to something crucial. Something that could change everything about this impossible situation. What if this restaurant sits on some kind of, I don't know, sacred ground, a place where death and compassion intersect in ways that create supernatural obligations? The lights overhead began to flicker, casting dancing shadows across the walls that seemed to move independently of their sources. The silence had become so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears like thunder. In 1836, I continued, my voice gaining strength even as the otherworldly atmosphere intensified around us. A homeless man died outside this restaurant, maybe from cold, maybe from hunger, maybe from the simple despair of being forgotten by the world, but instead of just dying and being forgotten, his death created a kind of spiritual debt. Marcus was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white, but his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that told me he was following my logic, even as it terrified him. The universe, or God, or whatever force governs these things, decided that death couldn't be the end for someone who died asking for nothing more than basic human kindness. So Thomas was brought back, not as himself, but as a vessel for an ongoing cycle of compassion that would ensure no one else would die the same way. The flickering lights suddenly steadied, but the silence around us had taken on a quality that felt almost sentient, as if the restaurant itself was listening to every word I spoke. But here's the thing about cosmic justice, I said, my voice now ringing with conviction. It's never quite as benevolent as it appears on the surface. The cycle wasn't created just to help homeless people, it was created to teach them, and everyone involved, that every act of kindness comes with a price. What kind of price? Marcus asked, though from the look in his eyes, I suspected he already knew. The price of understanding that true compassion can't be forced or manufactured. That kindness given out of obligation or supernatural compulsion isn't really kindness at all, it's just another form of imprisonment. I reached across the table and took Marcus's trembling hand in mine, feeling decades of accumulated pain and loneliness flowing through his skin like electricity. Don't you see? The cycle perpetuates itself because each person who accepts the gift thinks they're receiving kindness, when really they're just becoming another cog in a machine designed to demonstrate the futility of artificial compassion. Thomas, Eleanor, Robert, you, all of you, became wealthy and successful, but none of you ever experienced genuine human connection again. Marcus's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since our conversation began, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding something that had eluded him for 47 years. So what do we do? He whispered. How do we break something that was designed to be unbreakable? I looked around the restaurant, at the frozen diners and motionless servers, at the otherworldly stillness that had descended upon us like a blanket. Whatever force governed this place was clearly aware of our conversation, and the fact that it hadn't stopped us yet suggested that it wanted to see what conclusion we would reach. We break it by doing the one thing the cycle never accounted for, I said, my voice filled with a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere outside myself. We choose genuine kindness over supernatural obligation. *** Marcus, you've spent 47 years carrying wealth and success that never really belonged to you, waiting for the day when you could pass it on and finally be free. But what if freedom doesn't come from passing on the burden? What if it comes from choosing to break the cycle entirely? I stood up from the table, my decision crystallizing with each word I spoke. I'm going to walk out of this restaurant without eating another bite, but you're going to come with me. Marcus stared at me in shock. That's impossible. I can't leave, not until I've fulfilled my obligation. Your obligation is to a system that turns compassion into slavery, I said firmly. What if the real test isn't whether you can pass on the burden, but whether you can choose love over duty? The lights began flickering again, more violently this time, and I could swear I heard something that sounded like distant thunder rolling through the restaurant, though the night outside remained clear. If I don't complete the cycle, Marcus said desperately, I don't know what will happen to me. Maybe you'll die, I admitted. Maybe you'll age those 47 years in a single moment and crumble to dust, but maybe, just maybe, you'll finally remember who Marcus really was before all of this began. And if I'm wrong, if this destroys both of us, I smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt completely genuine. Then, at least, we'll face destruction, as ourselves, not as prisoners of someone else's design. The silence around us had become so profound that it felt like standing at the center of a vacuum. But through that silence, I could hear something else, the faint sound of Marcus's breath, as he weighed the choice between certain imprisonment and uncertain freedom. Together, he asked, his voice barely audible. Together, I confirmed, extending my hand toward him, and in that moment, as Marcus reached across the table to take my hand, the entire restaurant began to shake. The moment our hands touched, the world exploded around us in a kaleidoscope of light and sound that defied every law of physics I had ever learned. The restaurant didn't just shake, it seemed to tear apart at the seams, revealing glimpses of other times, other versions of this same scene playing out across decades and centuries. I saw Thomas in 1836, standing alone outside the restaurant, in clothes that marked him as a man from another era, his face gaunt with hunger but his eyes burning with a determination that transcended death itself. I saw Eleanor in 1883, her long dress dragging through the snow as she approached the same glass doors we had walked through tonight. Robert in 1930, his Depression-era desperation written in every line of his body as he begged for scraps that would change his life forever. But more than that, I saw the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of supernatural obligation and cosmic manipulation. Each of these people had been given the same choice Marcus and I faced now, and each of them had chosen the safety of predetermined fate over the terrifying freedom of genuine agency. The restaurant around us continued to fracture and reform, showing us glimpses of what could have been if any of them had chosen differently. Thomas, dying peacefully in 1883 as an old man who had lived his own life, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his real legacy forward. Eleanor, becoming a teacher as she had always dreamed, touching hundreds of lives through education rather than supernatural largesse. Do you see it? I shouted over the supernatural chaos swirling around us. Do you see what we're really choosing between? Marcus squeezed my hand tighter, his face a mask of terror and wonder as the visions continued to assault our senses. I see it, he called back. But Sarah, look. He pointed toward the center of the restaurant, where the air had begun to coalesce into something that might have been a figure, or might have been an absence where a figure should be. Whatever it was radiated a presence so ancient and vast that looking directly at it made my eyes water and my mind reel. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through our bones rather than our ears. You would break a cycle that has provided comfort to dozens of souls over more than a century. The question wasn't accusatory, it was genuinely curious. As if this cosmic force had never encountered beings willing to choose uncertainty over security before. Comfort built on the erasure of identity isn't comfort, I replied, somehow finding my voice despite the overwhelming presence bearing down on us. It's just a more elaborate form of death, and what would you offer in its place? I looked at Marcus, seeing in his eyes the reflection of my own desperate hope, the chance to choose kindness without compulsion, to help others because we want to, not because we're obligated to by supernatural contract. The presence seemed to consider this, and for a moment the chaos around us stilled to an almost peaceful quiet. You understand that choosing this path offers no guarantees, no wealth, no success, no safety net beyond what you can create for yourselves. We understand, Marcus said, his voice stronger now than I had heard it all evening. But we also understand that a life lived in service to someone else's design isn't really a life at all. And you, child of the streets, the presence turned its attention to me, and I felt its awareness pressing against my mind like a gentle but irresistible tide. You would choose the uncertainty of poverty over the security of wealth. I would choose the reality of struggle over the illusion of success, I answered, and I would choose to face that struggle with someone who understands the value of genuine human connection. The presence was quiet for so long that I began to wonder if it had disappeared entirely. The restaurant around us had stopped its violent transformations and settled into something that looked almost normal, except for the way the lights seemed to bend around the edges of our vision and the way the silence felt pregnant with possibilities. In 189 years, the presence finally said, no one has ever chosen to break the cycle. No one has ever valued freedom over security, authenticity over comfort, love over obligation. Then maybe it's time, Marcus said. Simply, the presence laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes made of starlight, beautiful and terrible and utterly alien. Perhaps it is. But understand this, if you walk out of this restaurant together, the cycle ends forever. The safety net that has caught dozens of souls over nearly 2 centuries disappears permanently. Future homeless individuals who might have benefited from this supernatural kindness will receive no such help. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket, but I didn't waver. Then it will be up to those of us who choose freedom to create real solutions, won't it? To build systems of help that don't require anyone to sacrifice their essential selves. And if you fail, if the world proves too harsh, too uncaring for such idealism to survive, I looked at Marcus, seeing in his face the same determination I felt building in my own chest. Then we'll fail as ourselves, trying to create something better, rather than succeeding as prisoners of someone else's design. The presence was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, not contemplative, but somehow final. The restaurant around us began to fade at the edges, becoming translucent and dreamlike. "Very well," the presence said, and there was something in its voice that might have been approval, or relief, or simply curiosity about what would happen next. "The cycle ends with your choice. But know this, the path you choose will test you in ways the supernatural safety net never would have." Asterisk, asterisk, as the presence's words echoed through the dissolving restaurant, I felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of reality around us. The expensive furnishings, the crystal chandelier, the marble floors, all of it began to fade like watercolors in the rain, revealing something much older and more primal beneath. The restaurant wasn't disappearing, it was revealing its true nature. The walls became rough stone, ancient and weathered by centuries of exposure to elements that had nothing to do with Manhattan weather. The floor transformed into packed earth, worn smooth by countless footsteps across decades and centuries, and in the center of it all, where our table had been, stood a simple wooden altar covered with offerings that spanned the ages, flowers that had been left yesterday sat next to coins from the Civil War era. Modern photographs of missing loved ones were arranged beside hand-drawn portraits from the 1800s. This wasn't just a restaurant, it was a shrine. A place where people had been coming for nearly 2 centuries to leave tokens of hope and desperation. "Do you understand now?" the presence asked, its voice somehow warmer and more human than before. This place was never about the cycle. The cycle was just a side effect of something much more important. Marcus's hand tightened in mine as we both stared at the altar, beginning to comprehend the true scope of what we had stumbled into. "It's a memorial," he whispered, "for everyone who died alone and forgotten." "Not just a memorial," I added, the pieces finally clicking into place in my mind. "It's a beacon, a place where the energy of all that accumulated loneliness and desperation gets transformed into something else." Asterisk, the presence pulsed with what felt like approval. "For 189 years, people have been drawn to this place when they reach the absolute depths of human despair. Most leave offerings and prayers, hoping against hope that someone, somewhere, will remember they existed. But a few, the ones who were truly at the end of everything, were chosen to experience a different kind of remembrance." I thought about Thomas, standing outside in 1836, not just hungry, but dying. About Eleanor in 1883, Robert in 1930, Marcus in 1977, and finally, me tonight. All of us had been at the exact same point. Not just homeless, but ready to give up entirely. "The wealth, the success, the 47 years of prosperity," Marcus said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. "It was never about the money, was it? It was about being remembered, about mattering to the world in a way that would last. But it came at the cost of remembering ourselves," I added. "We were preserved as monuments to compassion, but not as human beings." The altar before us began to glow with a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself. As it did, I could see more clearly the true nature of the offerings people had left. They weren't just tokens of desperation, they were fragments of identity, pieces of souls that people had left behind when they couldn't carry the weight of being forgotten any longer. "What happens now?" I asked. "If the cycle is broken, what happens to all of this accumulated pain and hope?" The presence was quiet for a long moment, and I could feel it considering possibilities that had never existed before tonight. "That," it finally said, "depends on what you choose to do with the freedom you've claimed." Marcus looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the same terrible and wonderful realization that was dawning in my own mind. We hadn't just chosen to escape the cycle, we had chosen to inherit responsibility for something much larger and more important. "The people who come here," I said slowly, working through the implications, "they're still going to come. They're still going to be desperate, still going to need help. But now there won't be any supernatural intervention to ease their suffering. Unless," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "we choose to be that intervention, not as prisoners of cosmic obligation, but as human beings who understand what it means to stand on the edge of oblivion." I felt something shift inside my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the supernatural forces swirling around us, and everything to do with the simple recognition of purpose, freely chosen. "We could use your wealth, the real wealth you earned during these 47 years to create something genuinely helpful. Not magical intervention, but practical solutions. A shelter, Marcus said, his eyes lighting up with possibility. Not just a place to sleep, but a place where people can remember who they are while they figure out who they want to become. A place where kindness doesn't come with invisible strings attached, I added, where help is offered without expectation of supernatural reciprocity. The presence around us pulsed with something that felt distinctly like joy, and the altar before us began to change. The ancient offerings didn't disappear, but new ones began to appear alongside them. Fresh flowers, contemporary photographs, modern tokens of hope and desperation that spoke to the eternal nature of human suffering and resilience. You would take on the burden of caring for these souls without any guarantee of success, the presence asked, without the safety net of supernatural intervention to ensure your efforts bear fruit. We would take on the privilege of caring for them, I corrected gently. Because the alternative, leaving them to face their despair alone, is unacceptable. Marcus squeezed my hand, and I felt decades of isolation and artificial purpose flowing out of him like water from a broken dam. For 47 years, I've been living someone else's idea of success. For the first time, since I was 23 years old, I have the chance to choose what success actually means. The glow from the altar intensified, and I realized that the light wasn't just illumination, it was transformation. The supernatural weight that had been pressing down on Marcus for nearly half a century was lifting, replaced by something lighter, but infinitely more meaningful. Then, let it be done, the presence said, its voice now tinged with something that sounded remarkably like pride. Let the cycle end, and let genuine choice begin. The ancient shrine around us began to fade, but this time it wasn't dissolving into nothingness, it was transforming into something new. The stone walls became warm wood paneling, the packed earth floor became polished hardwood, and the altar transformed into a simple reception desk surrounded by comfortable chairs and soft lighting. But more than the physical transformation, I could feel something deeper changing. The oppressive weight of supernatural obligation was lifting from the very air around us, replaced by the lighter but more substantial weight of freely chosen responsibility. What is this place? I asked, though part of me already knew. It's whatever you choose to make it, the presence replied, its voice already growing fainter as its work in this realm neared completion. A shelter, a counseling center, a place of refuge. The form matters less than the intention behind it. Marcus was staring around the transformed space with wonder, and I could see in his face that he was remembering something he had lost decades ago, the simple joy of having a purpose that belonged entirely to him. But as the presence began to withdraw completely, leaving us alone in our newly inherited responsibility, I felt a chill of uncertainty creep into my chest. We had chosen freedom over security, authenticity over comfort. But the magnitude of what we had taken on was only beginning to dawn on me. As the presence faded completely and the supernatural atmosphere lifted from around us, I was struck by how quiet the world suddenly seemed. After hours of cosmic forces and otherworldly interventions, the simple sound of our own breathing felt almost deafeningly normal. Both Marcus and I stood in the center of what had once been an exclusive restaurant and was now something entirely different, a space that hummed with potential but offered no roadmap for how to fulfill it. The weight of our decisions settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat, warm with purpose but substantial enough to make every step forward require conscious effort. Sarah, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a note I hadn't heard before. Uncertainty, yes, but also something that might have been excitement. I need to tell you something that I haven't told anyone in 47 years. I turned to look at him, really look at him. And for the first time since we'd met, I saw not the wealthy businessman who had been shaped by supernatural forces, but glimpses of the 23-year-old boy from Detroit who had once dreamed of being a teacher. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly on the words. For nearly half a century, every major decision in my life has been guided by forces beyond my control. Every business deal, every investment, every relationship, all of it orchestrated by whatever power governs this place. I don't know if I remember how to make choices that are purely my own. The honesty in his confession broke something open in my chest, and I realized that beneath my own fear and uncertainty lay something I hadn't expected: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone with no other options, but the steady, sustainable hope of someone who has chosen their path with full knowledge of its difficulties. I'm scared too, I told him. But I'm more scared of who I would have become if I had accepted the easy path. And I think I think maybe being scared is exactly what we need right now. What do you mean? I gestured around the transformed space, at the comfortable chairs and warm lighting that seemed to invite conversation and connection. The people who are going to come through those doors, they're going to be terrified. They're going to be at the absolute end of their resources, physical and emotional and spiritual. If we're going to help them, we need to remember what that terror feels like. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. The supernatural safety net wasn't just a trap for us, it was a barrier between us and the people we were supposed to help. How can you truly empathize with someone's desperation when you know your own problems will be magically resolved? Exactly. But now, I paused, feeling the truth of it settle in my bones. Now we're going to face every challenge the same way they do. No cosmic interventions, no guaranteed success. Just human beings trying to help other human beings with whatever resources we can gather and whatever wisdom we can earn. The first test of our new reality came sooner than either of us expected. As we stood there, absorbing the magnitude of our situation, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of someone crying outside the front door. Marcus and I looked at each other, and I saw my own mixture of determination and terror reflected in his face. This was it. Our first opportunity to prove that genuine kindness could exist without supernatural compulsion. I walked to the door and opened it to find a young man, probably no older than 19, huddled against the building with tears streaming down his face. His clothes were damp from the December snow, and his entire body was shaking with cold and exhaustion that I recognized all too well. "Hey," I said softly, crouching down to his level. "Are you okay?" He looked up at me with eyes that held the same desperate emptiness I had seen in my own reflection during my worst moments on the streets. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know I'm not supposed to be here. I just, I didn't know where else to go." "You're exactly where you're supposed to be," I told him, extending my hand. "My name is Sarah. Would you like to come inside where it's warm?" As he took my hand and allowed me to help him to his feet, I felt something I had never experienced. During all my months of homelessness, the profound satisfaction of being able to offer help without any ulterior motive, supernatural or otherwise. Marcus appeared beside me, and I watched as something beautiful happened. Instead of the polished businessman he had been for decades, I saw the teacher he had once dreamed of becoming emerging in the gentle way he guided the young man inside. In the patient tone he used to ask simple questions about his immediate needs. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, as we settled the young man into one of the comfortable chairs. "David," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I've been living in my car for 3 weeks, but it got repossessed this morning. I spent my last $5 on coffee just so I could sit somewhere warm for a few hours, but they kicked me out when I fell asleep." I felt Marcus tense beside me, and I knew he was experiencing the same thing I was, the recognition of our former selves in this young man's story, but also the overwhelming realization of how many Davids there were in the world, and how impossible it seemed to help them all. But then Marcus did something that surprised me. Instead of offering immediate solutions or making grand promises, he simply said, "That sounds terrifying. I'm sorry you're going through this." The simple acknowledgement of David's fear and pain without trying to immediately fix it seemed to unlock something in the young man. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since we'd found him, he made eye contact. "I keep thinking I must have done something wrong," David said. "Like, maybe if I had made different choices, worked harder, been smarter, I feel like such a failure." "You're not a failure," I said firmly. "You're a human being, in an impossible situation, doing the best you can with the resources you have. The system failed you, not the other way around." As I spoke those words, I realized I was learning something crucial about the difference between supernatural kindness and genuine human compassion. The cosmic forces that had governed this place for centuries had focused on providing material comfort, but they had never addressed the deeper need that drove people to desperation, the need to be seen, understood, and valued as human beings. "We can offer you a warm place to sleep tonight," Marcus said, "but more than that, we can offer you a place where you don't have to pretend to be anything other than exactly who you are right now." David began crying again, but these were different tears, not the desperate sobs of someone who had given up, but the relieved tears of someone who had finally found a place where their humanity was recognized and honored. As I watched Marcus comfort this young man with a gentleness that came from deep personal understanding rather than supernatural compulsion, I realized that we had made the right choice. The path ahead would be difficult, uncertain, and fraught with the possibility of failure, but it would be our path, walked with our own feet toward goals we had chosen with our own hearts. But even as I felt that certainty settling in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that our biggest test was still to come. Over the following weeks, word spread through the invisible networks that connect the city's most vulnerable people. They came to us in a steady stream, individuals who had fallen through every crack in the social safety net, people who had been written off by family, friends, and society at large. Each person who walked through our doors brought their own unique story of loss and resilience, but they all shared something fundamental. They had reached the point where they needed help not just to survive, but to remember why survival was worth the effort. Marcus threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if he was trying to make up for 47 years of artificial existence by cramming a lifetime of genuine purpose into every day. He used his accumulated wealth not just to fund our operations, but to learn everything he could about homelessness, addiction, mental health, and the complex systems that either helped or hindered recovery. But it was during our third week of operation that we encountered the case that would test everything we thought we understood about the choice we had made. Her name was Margaret, and she was 83 years old. She had been living in her car for 6 months after losing her apartment when her landlord sold the building to developers. Her social security check wasn't enough to cover rent in the gentrified neighborhood where she had lived for 30 years, and every low-income housing program had waiting lists that stretched for years. What made Margaret's case particularly heartbreaking was that she wasn't just homeless, she was dying. The cancer that had started in her lungs had spread throughout her body, and the treatments she needed were far beyond what her Medicare coverage would provide. "I'm not looking for miracles," she told us on the evening she first appeared at our door, her voice carrying the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of facing hardship with grace. "I just don't want to die alone in my car." Marcus and I looked at each other across the room, and I saw in his eyes the same terrible realization that was dawning in my own mind. In the old system, the supernatural forces that governed this place might have intervened. Margaret might have been chosen for the cycle, given 47 years of health and prosperity in exchange for her eventual servitude to cosmic obligation. But now, under our stewardship, we had no miracles to offer. We had a warm bed, nutritious food, companionship, and whatever medical care we could afford to provide. But we couldn't heal her cancer or give her more time than her body was willing to provide. "We can't promise you miracles," I told her honestly, "but we can promise you won't face whatever comes next alone." Margaret smiled, and there was something in her expression that reminded me of the presence we had encountered in the restaurant, ancient, wise, and somehow at peace with mysteries that would terrify most people. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "at my age, the biggest miracle is finding people who see you as human being instead of a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed." Over the following days, as Margaret settled into our small community, I began to understand something profound about the nature of the choice Marcus and I had made. We hadn't just chosen to help homeless people, we had chosen to bear witness to the full spectrum of human experience, including the parts that couldn't be fixed or improved or solved. Margaret became the unofficial grandmother of our little refuge, offering wisdom and perspective to the younger people who came to us carrying burdens they thought were unique to their generation. She helped David, the young man we had found that first night, understand that his worth as a person wasn't tied to his economic productivity. She counseled a woman named Rita who was struggling with addiction, sharing stories from her own past, about the times she had lost herself and found her way back. But as the weeks passed and Margaret's condition worsened, I found myself struggling with questions that the supernatural system had never forced me to confront. What was the point of offering help to someone we couldn't save? What good did it do to provide comfort to someone who was inevitably going to suffer and die? It was Marcus who helped me understand the answer during one of our late-night conversations. As we sat with Margaret during a particularly difficult evening, "For 47 years," he said quietly, "I had the power to solve people's problems with money. I could write a check and make their immediate difficulties disappear. But I never learned how to sit with someone while they faced problems that couldn't be solved." Margaret, despite her pain, managed a weak smile. "That's the difference between charity and love," she whispered. "Charity tries to fix things, love just shows up." Her words hit me like a physical blow, because I realized she was describing the fundamental flaw in the supernatural system we had escaped. The cosmic forces that had governed this place for centuries had been offering charity, material solutions that addressed symptoms without touching the deeper needs of the human soul. But what Margaret was asking for, what all of our guests were asking for, was love, the simple recognition of their inherent worth as human beings, regardless of their circumstances or their ability to contribute to society. 3 days later, Margaret died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family during her final weeks. As we sat with her body in those first moments after her passing, I felt something I had never experienced before, the profound privilege of having been trusted with someone's vulnerability at the moment of their ultimate transition. "Did we do enough?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with grief and uncertainty. I looked around the room at the faces of the people Margaret had touched during her brief time with us. David, who had been suicidal when we found him, was now volunteering to help new arrivals feel welcome. Rita, who had been clean for 2 weeks, was holding the hand of a newcomer who was going through withdrawal. A dozen other people who had found their way to us were creating a community based not on shared prosperity or supernatural intervention, but on the simple recognition of their mutual humanity. "We did what she asked for," I said finally. "We made sure she didn't die alone. And in the process, she taught all of us what it really means to be alive." But even as I said those words, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's death was just the beginning of a much larger test. The supernatural system had offered easy answers to impossible questions, but the path we had chosen demanded that we find meaning in uncertainty, purpose in limitation, and hope in the face of inevitable loss. And I was about to discover just how difficult that could be. Margaret's death marked a turning point in our small community that I hadn't anticipated. While her passing brought us closer together in some ways, it also forced everyone to confront the reality that no amount of kindness or community support could protect us from the fundamental uncertainties of human existence. Some people found this realization liberating. It freed them from the impossible burden of trying to earn their way out of suffering through good behavior or positive thinking. But others found it terrifying, and within a week of Margaret's funeral, 3 of our regular residents had disappeared back into the streets, choosing the familiar despair of isolation over the uncertain hope of community. "Maybe we're doing this wrong," Marcus said one evening as we sat in the empty chairs where those 3 people used to spend their evenings. "Maybe the supernatural system existed because this is just too hard for human beings to handle on their own." I understood his doubt because I felt it too. Every night, I lay awake wondering if we had been naive to think that genuine human kindness could compete with the powerful simplicity of magical intervention. The old system had offered clear cause and effect: accept the gift, receive wealth and success, pass it on. After 47 years, our approach offered nothing but uncertainty, community, and the promise that whatever happened, it would be real. But it was a conversation with David that helped me understand why our choice, difficult as it was, remained the right one. "I've been thinking about Margaret a lot," he told me one afternoon, as we prepared dinner for the evening group. "And I realized something that I don't think I understood when she was alive." "What's that?" "She was the first person I ever met who was dying who wasn't angry about it. I mean, she was sad, and she was scared sometimes, but she wasn't furious at the universe for being unfair. And I couldn't figure out why until after she was gone." David paused in his chopping to look at me directly, and I saw in his eyes a depth of understanding that hadn't been there when he first arrived at our door. She wasn't angry because she had spent her last weeks being seen and valued for exactly who she was, not for who she might become if she got better, not for who she had been before she got sick, but for who she was right then, in that moment. Dying and scared and still somehow beautiful. His words hit me with the force of revelation, because they articulated something I had been feeling but couldn't express. The supernatural system had offered people the chance to become someone else, wealthy, successful, powerful. But what we were offering was something much more radical and much more difficult: the chance to be fully themselves. "That's why some people leave," I said, understanding dawning in my voice. "Because being fully yourself is actually harder than becoming someone else." "Exactly," David agreed. "It's easier to be a rich person carrying out supernatural obligations than it is to be a poor person figuring out what your actual values are." That conversation stayed with me for days, especially as we continued to receive new arrivals who tested our philosophy in different ways. There was James, a veteran with PTSD who had been living in the subway tunnels for 3 years. His trauma was so severe that he couldn't tolerate being around other people for more than a few minutes at a time. But he kept returning to our door night after night, drawn by something he couldn't articulate. "I don't understand what you people want from me," he said during one of his brief visits. "Every other place I've been, they want me to get clean, get therapy, find a job, become a productive member of society. But you just let me be crazy." "We don't think you're crazy," Marcus replied gently. "We think you're a human being who has been through experiences that would break most people, and you're doing the best you can to survive them." James stared at Marcus for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with the radical concept that his worth as a person wasn't contingent on his ability to overcome his trauma. "But what if I never get better?" he asked. "What if this is as good as it gets for me?" "Then this is as good as it gets," I said simply. "And that's still enough. You're still enough." James began crying then, not the desperate tears of someone in crisis, but the relieved tears of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden and had finally been given permission to set it down. It was interactions like this that helped me understand the true nature of what we had chosen when we broke the supernatural cycle. We hadn't just rejected magical solutions to material problems, we had rejected the entire premise that human worth was conditional on performance, improvement, or contribution to society. But our most challenging test came in the form of a person I never expected to see again: Robert, the man who had initiated Marcus into the supernatural cycle 47 years earlier. I was working late one evening, updating our meager financial records and trying to figure out how to stretch our resources to accommodate the growing number of people who needed our help, when I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, I found an elderly man who looked like he had aged several lifetimes in the span of a few months. "Is Marcus here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I ask who's looking for him?" The man's face crumpled with an emotion so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. "My name is Robert Chen. I'm his father." The words hit me like a physical blow, because I realized that the man standing before me wasn't just Robert, he was what Marcus would have become if he had completed the cycle. Aged beyond his years, stripped of the supernatural wealth and success that had defined his existence, and carrying the terrible weight of remembering 47 years of a life that had never really belonged to him. "He told me you were dead," I said softly. "I was," Robert replied. "In every way that mattered. I was dead from the moment I passed the burden to him. But when the cycle broke, he paused, struggling to find words for an experience that defied description. "When you and Marcus chose to end it, something changed. I started remembering things, not just about the 47 years of wealth, but about who I was before, about the son I loved and lost to cosmic forces beyond our control." I led Robert inside, my heart breaking for the reunion I was about to facilitate. Marcus looked up from the book he was reading to one of our residents, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw Robert was one of the most complex mixtures of joy, grief, anger, and love I had ever witnessed. "Dad," Marcus whispered, and in that single word I heard the voice of the 23-year-old boy who had been lost for nearly half a century. What followed was the most difficult and beautiful conversation I had ever witnessed. A father and son reclaiming their relationship across decades of supernatural separation, learning to see each other not as cosmic victims or agents of fate, but as human beings who had been given an impossible second chance. But Robert's return also brought news that would challenge everything we thought we understood about the choice we had made. There are others," Robert said during his second night with us, as the three of us sat around the small table where Margaret used to hold court with her stories and wisdom. "Other people who were part of the cycle over the years, who were starting to remember who they were before." Marcus looked up sharply from the tea he had been mechanically stirring. "What do you mean, remember? I thought the transformation was permanent." "So did I," Robert replied, his voice heavy with the weight of revelations that were clearly as shocking to him as they were to us. "But when the cycle broke, something fundamental shifted in the cosmic balance that had been holding us all in place. Eleanor contacted me 3 days ago. She's 96 years old now, living in a nursing home in Boston. But she's starting to remember her life before 1883. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the December cold seeping through the windows. If everyone who was part of the cycle is starting to remember their original selves, that means ... That means there are potentially dozens of people out there who are going through the same crisis of identity that I went through when the wealth disappeared. Robert finished for me. People who spent decades living lives that weren't their own, who are now trying to figure out who they really are underneath all those years of supernatural influence. Marcus set down his teacup with shaking hands, and I could see the magnitude of this revelation hitting him like a tsunami. Dad, how many people are we talking about? I've been able to contact 7 so far, but based on what Eleanor remembers about the people who came before her, there could be as many as 20 or 30 people still alive who were part of the cycle at some point. The weight of responsibility that settled on my shoulders in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the daunting prospect of trying to help that many people through existential crises that would make our current challenges seem simple by comparison. It was the realization that our choice to break the cycle had created a ripple effect that we never could have anticipated. They're going to need help, I said quietly. Not just practical support, but help figuring out who they are when everything they thought they knew about themselves turns out to have been a cosmic lie. Some of them are handling it better than others, Robert said carefully. Eleanor seems to have found a kind of peace in remembering her original dreams of being a teacher. She's started volunteering at the nursing home, sharing stories with other residents who have trouble remembering their own pasts. And the others. Robert's face darkened. Thomas tried to kill himself last week. He's in a psychiatric hospital in Chicago, completely overwhelmed by memories that span over a century of existence. And there's a woman named Patricia who was part of the cycle in the 1960s. She's disappeared entirely. Her family thinks she might be living on the streets again, trying to recreate the circumstances that led to her original encounter with the supernatural system. Marcus buried his face in his hands, and I could feel the guilt radiating from him like heat from a fever. This is our fault. We broke something without fully understanding the consequences, and now people are suffering because of our choice. No, Robert said firmly, reaching across the table to place a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. This is the consequence of choosing freedom over security, authenticity over comfort. Some people aren't going to handle that choice well, but that doesn't mean the choice was wrong. I thought about Margaret, about the peace she had found in being allowed to die as herself rather than as some idealized version of who she might have been. I thought about David, about the way he had blossomed when given permission to be exactly who he was without having to earn that acceptance through improvement or productivity. We can't save everyone, I said, the words feeling like glass in my throat, but we can offer the same thing to these people that we offer to everyone who comes through our doors. A place where they can figure out who they really are without judgment or pressure to be anyone else. But how do we even find them? Marcus asked. And once we do, how do we help people process more than a century of accumulated identity confusion? It was Robert who provided the answer, though it came in a form I never would have expected. Eleanor wants to help, he said. She remembers more about the early days of the cycle than anyone else still alive, and she has insights about the psychological process of recovering authentic identity after decades of supernatural influence. She's proposed creating a kind of support network for cycle survivors. The idea was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. Bringing together people who had been part of the supernatural system could provide them with the unique understanding and support they needed to navigate their identity crises, but it also meant taking responsibility for the well-being of individuals whose needs were far beyond anything Marcus and I had prepared for. What would that look like practically? I asked. Eleanor suggests starting with a retreat, Robert explained. Somewhere quiet and safe where cycle survivors can come together to share their experiences and begin the process of rediscovering their authentic selves. She's even offered to fund it, apparently. Unlike the rest of us, she managed to hold on to some of her supernatural wealth when the cycle broke. Marcus looked at me across the table, and I saw in his eyes the same mixture of fear and determination that I felt building in my own chest. We had chosen the path of uncertainty and authenticity, and that path was leading us into territory that neither of us had imagined when we first made our decision. If we do this, I said slowly, we need to understand that we're not just starting a support group, we're taking responsibility for helping people reconstruct their entire sense of self after decades, or even centuries, of living as someone else. I know, Marcus replied. But Sarah, what if we don't? What if we let fear of the magnitude of the task prevent us from helping people who are suffering because of a choice we made? I thought about Thomas in his psychiatric hospital, about Patricia living on the streets again, about the other cycle survivors who were struggling to make sense of identities that had been subsumed by supernatural obligation. The old system would have left them trapped in their false identities forever. But our choice had freed them to face the terrifying prospect of discovering who they really were. Then we're not really living according to the values that led us to break the cycle in the first place, I said finally. Robert smiled, and for the first time since his arrival, I saw glimpses of the man he had been before. 47 years of supernatural servitude had worn away his authentic self. Eleanor said you would say that, he told us. She said that anyone brave enough to choose uncertainty over security would be brave enough to help others make the same choice. As we began to plan what would become the first gathering of cycle survivors in nearly 2 centuries, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a mantle. But underneath that weight was something else, the steady, sustainable hope that comes from knowing you're walking a path that honors the